So nice to chat. And also, and after we originally chatted just for such a short time back at Harrogate as well, just a brief,
Yeah. Hi, hello there, everybody. I'm here with Gytha Lodge to talk about her latest Lie Beside Me, which comes out on audio on Thursday, but it's already available in ebook. And could you tell us a bit about the plot, please, Gytha?
Oh, I'd love to. So, Lie Beside Me is, despite it being the third book in the Jonas Jean series, it's very much one I wanted people to be able to start with if they were interested. It's about a young woman called Louise Reeks who has a really big night out and can't remember getting home when she wakes up early in the morning. She rolls over to cuddle her husband, only to find out that the man lying next to her is not only not her husband, but is in fact dead quite violently, and she has no memory of how it happened. So the book is told equally from her perspective as she tries frantically to work it out and to hide everything whilst she does. And then Jonas Sheens and his team, he's a DCI, trying to work out the actual truth and sort of get round the barriers she throws up, and basically realise whether the lies she's telling are hiding something terrible or something related to somebody else, basically.
Yeah, that was great for me to listen to it this weekend, and thank you for the early copy as well. That's lovely.
Oh, it was so nice to be able to get it to you.
Yeah.
We had a bit of a scare, didn't we, where it looked like might not be ready in time because the audiobook had a fault and they pushed it back by a week. But now it's all okay, and it's out on Thursday, and we managed to get Alex a copy just early enough.
I was quite relieved actually, because I thought it would be a bit awkward if I had not been able to read it. Yeah. The book itself, because it's split into two perspectives, is something you've done before. Why are you so comfortable with that technique?
It's an odd one. I don't even know. It's very odd. It just seems to be how it occurs to me to write a book every time it's a mystery. There seems to be no rhyme or reason to it. I don't know if I've been influenced by other people along the way without really sort of realising it. But I think one of the reasons is that I really like to make sure that everyone feels for the victim. I like to feel that crimes are not about just a puzzle to be solved and they're not just a game. Because in the real world, obviously, when someone is murdered, it has an enormous impact on many, many people's lives and is a terrible thing. And regardless of how we might feel about the victim, whether they did some things wrong in their lives, they are human beings who deserve to be mourned. And in the vast majority of cases, had done nothing to bring it on themselves. So I suppose one of the reasons is that it means I get to show the other side of everything. So certainly when I started with She Lies in Wait, I wanted to write half of it from the perspective of Aurora, who is the missing murdered girl. So you see her view as it builds towards the conclusion. And I think it just adds a little bit more, a bit more of that pathos and lets you see into their head. Whereas with Lie Beside Me, it's a little different because actually it's from the perspective of someone who may or may not have done it and has their own very large journey of sort of discovery and memory to go on. But hopefully still gives you a bit of an insight into the victim, Alex, and what he represented and how lovely he was or not, depending.
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, because you're telling it from the perspective you are doing, it reveals it slower than it would have done if you'd done it from the the victim and his family relations from the point of view of that. But because you did it that way, it revealed it slower, which I thought was the better way of doing it. And I've not seen many people do it that way before. So
Oh,
yeah.
that's cool. I mean, that's hopefully a good thing. You always wonder, don't you? It's like, do people not do this because it's a bad idea, or is it because it's they just haven't thought of it yet?
Yeah, it definitely is a good thing. Going back to your first book, she Lies in Wait, though, you did it from so many different perspectives that you actually narrated a part in the audiobook yourself.
I did. So after Aurora goes missing on that night, obviously there's nothing from her perspective because it would give it away. So after a certain point, the narration shifts to the next morning when all of the friends who were with her that night, they were camping, realise that she's gone. And I really wanted to show that, because I think, again, that's some of the most important stuff, is the realisation that someone is missing and what you do. And when the fear and the panic hit, you know, who reacts in what way, particularly how do you deal with this when you've just been partying all night and, you know, quite hedonistically having a good time. So there are two other perspectives. There's a perspective of her sister, who has very complex feelings towards it, because there's guilt that she didn't look after her, but they had a slightly, you know, challenging relationship at times. And then there is Connor, who is the young man who first makes the discovery, who's someone with quite a lot of sort of resentment. So in the end, a couple of those chapters ended up getting done by me, and it was great, actually. I really enjoyed getting to do it. It was, I mean, there's obviously a difference between me reading it and the amazing professionals reading it, but it was a real blast to do.
But of course, you have got a background in the theatre yourself, so it wasn't exactly completely unusual, right. I imagine.
Yeah, I suppose it was really nice to sort of do a little bit of something which felt dramatic again, because it's been quite a while for me. And when I used to, I did act quite a lot when I was much younger, and then when I sort of started writing my own plays, my real priority became writing them and then directing them. So I wasn't intentionally acting, but what inevitably used to happen was that somebody would be ill at some critical point, or would have to miss a chunk of a run, or, you know, it's particularly in rehearsals, I'd have to stand in a lot, but even in actual performances, we had someone who had to go to a trial, which was stressful for them, and obviously I wanted to make them feel okay about it by stepping in. And on one occasion, slightly stressfully, our lead in The Life of Lucretia Borgia basically had to leave the show very, very shortly before it went on. And I was literally the only person who knew the words, and there was no way anyone else was going to be able to sort of slot in. So it had to be me. So having written all of this incredibly debauched stuff, which I was fully expecting actors to do, I then had to go and do it myself. I mean, it must have, to a certain extent, it must have worked, because I ended up having a relationship with one of the guys that I seduced in the play for like the next 3.5 years. So, you know, must have been all right.
Yeah, seems to have worked. I mean, when I met you after the New Blood panel at Theakston's, that must have been a really different introduction into the crime universe that you probably weren't expecting to start with.
No, it was absolutely incredible. I think it's something that a lot of authors have said to me, and I was probably quite aware of, because I've tried to fill theatres myself, you know, a lot for a long time, was they're saying, you know, you're not going to get 750 people in a room again for a very long time, if you ever manage it. And I was acutely aware that it was an enormous honour to have Val support, and to have this, you know, this huge number of people willing to listen to, you know, in part what I had to say, and to get to introduce them to my first book, where I really felt I was such a novice to all this. And it was an incredible experience. And I think Val does this just amazing job of bringing debut writers on in a way that, you know, I don't know anyone who has quite such an impact as she does with that event. And yeah, it was incredible.
When you were coming up with the story for She Lies in Wait, and the backstory elements, which drew me into the series, why did you decide to give Jonah such a big part in the story, as well as the investigation too?
Yeah, so it was something I was sort of dithering about early on, was how involved to make him. And I just loved the idea of someone who had been peripherally involved in the initial investigation, and who had basically known the victim, even in a very vague way. So being drawn back in after all that time. So for him, it's not only this case, which is very important to solve, but it's also a huge unraveling of sort of things he'd packed away. And for Jonah, she really is this person who he has never really stopped looking for. Because I think when you're 19 and you're a newly minted constable, and then one of your earliest cases is this huge investigation into a girl that you knew, I can imagine that you wouldn't stop looking. And I felt there was just such a satisfying sense of, I don't know, of potential closure for him coming, as well as the discomfort of having to dig up his own past along with everyone else's, that I just thought it was the way it had to go. I also love the idea of nostalgia. I'm a big fan of books which have a strong element of it in them, and for him and for those kids, that night really changed everything for them, because before that night they were all kids to a certain extent, even Jonah, who was a police officer by this stage. And by the time that night had finished, they were suddenly in a very dark, very adult world, trying to work out what happened to this girl and whether one of their own group had been part of it, which is a pretty maturing process, I think.
Given the complex world of police and the network of characters, it was important to have backstories for the others as well. And I mean, I know you've got a long-running series now, so what made you decide to drip the stories of the other police in? And when do you decide that this book would be suitable for that backstory?
So I actually wanted to put all of their backstories in the beginning book. So I really wanted, because I love to feel characters have an anchoring in the real world, and they've got their own stories and their past and their histories, and I wanted all of them to have quite chunky backstories, and then their subplots going on. And in fact, it's my editor who said to me, you are planning on a whole series, you really don't have to do all of this in the first book. You can tease it through, it's fine. And I think he was quite right, because actually it was getting to the point where it was too complicated, because I had people trying to remember not only a cast of characters from the murder, but then the police team as well. That's another 4 people, plus a few related to people who get drawn into it. And it's a lot of characters. And even as it is, I think a few people said there are quite a lot of characters in this book. It took me a little while to get used to them. So he was right, darn him. But I then had a very clear idea that I wanted all of them to come out as the series progressed. And I like that feeling of my characters having their own sort of slower story, my police team, that they have this arc that just goes on. And you get, because relationships change between people, you get sort of tension over different things, and all of them have sort of strange or difficult things happening in their lives. And I think that's because it's something that I enjoy so much when I read series. I really wanted to have that in there too, to really, to let them have their stories and their arc and their path, and not to feel like if you picked up one book and then you picked up, book 10, that actually the detectives wouldn't have changed at all in that time. Because I think there should be some growth and some change.
When you're deciding on the series, we were talking about it in an earlier interview that you've got an arc that's running over 6 books when we spoke 2 years ago. So how many books is it now you've got an arc for?
Yeah, I think it's probably 8 now at least, depending on how much I get away with squeezing into each book. It's hard to know. Because so yeah, there are so many things that I can see that I want to happen, and quite a lot of them will take time. And I feel conscious of the moment. So, as far as we've come in book 3, some of the characters have definitely had more space than others, and that I think is good, because that's how it should work. Yeah. They've got their important stories, but then I'd like to make sure that the others have their time and their space too. So, I mean, it's got to be at least 8, which means I'm going to have to think of some more crimes.
Because I'm waiting to see what the other backstories are for the other policemen, because there's only been like Jonah and Hansen so far.
That's right. So it's only 50% of the team have got their, and that's not even all of their backstories yet. So it's there's loads to go.
When you were working on the story for book 2, it was very modern, with Skype and a murder on it. What made you decide to go for that? Was so modern, but you had no idea that all of us would be using it as often as we do now.
It's very true. It became strangely topical, didn't it? And I'd had that idea sort of at the same time as I had the idea of She Lies in Wait, or just afterwards. And I really liked it because it was, I could go from a kind of cold case and being nostalgic, and a sort of investigation which was all about other ways of doing things than mobile phones or technology, to one that really had technology at its heart. and still show that actually really the fundamental elements of a case are still the people, and whether or not they're messed up and what happened in their lives to bring them to this point where a murder happened. Because one of Jonah's big beliefs is that there is no inevitability to someone dying on a certain day. It's not that all the pieces are lined up and it will happen. It's about what happens at that time. And even if someone has or hasn't planned it, you can still have a situation where someone thinks they're going to kill someone and decides against it at the last minute. So I think it was fun to sort of play with something technological, but to still have it very character focused. And I'd had this idea a while back about someone witnessing a murder over Skype, and liked the idea because it just made me feel a bit creeped out by that. And that's the fundamental of how I do all my book ideas, is if it doesn't make me go ooh, or that makes me feel quite some strange and uncomfortable and a bit thrilled, then I don't use the idea, because I think that's what I like to get out of an opening and a concept and a beginning of a story.
When working on a prologue, do you write that before and then, or does it come later after you've come up with the story and then you put it in?
So the prologue is definitely my starting point and my big kind of idea. I'm just going to spend 1 second telling a 10-year-old how to find some cutlery, because I have left him to do his own dinner and it's a bit mean of me. So 1 second when I tell him.
I think I know.
It's in the black box. Here we go. I have an overflow cutlery box and then the main cutlery drawer, and it's very complicated for a 10-year-old.
Yeah.
Poor thing. But he's fine. He did eventually hear the oven beeping and there was no smoke, so I was thinking he's doing quite well, really.
Yeah.
So back to the prologues. They are my absolute favourite thing. I love them in books that I read, because I think it is the thing that makes me decide whether I'm going to buy a book. So I always want them to be really grabby and hooky and exciting, and so that's always where I start, is with this sort of single idea at the beginning and where that's going to open. But then I have to, before I pitch it to my editor, I have to be pretty confident of where it's then going to go, because I don't like to not know basically where it's going to go. And I think Watching from the Dark was the only one that I pitched a little bit uncertainly, because I was just pitching it as a sort of second idea to go with my first book. So that's the only one where I hadn't really decided the whole detail of the story. And the best thing about that was actually we then worked on it together, and Joel, who is my fabulous editor at Penguin, had lots of input and feedback, and I think it was by far the better book for it. So that was fab.
When you were coming up with the plotline for Lie Beside Me, though, what was the thing that you'd learned from the other two that you say made this one different?
So I suppose to a certain extent with this one, I had already actually had a different idea lined up, and I wasn't really happy with it, because although it gave me a bit of a chill, it was kind of it wasn't a very warm-hearted book. And I just realised that really, realistically, that's what I love. I love a bit of a chill and something, scary and something strange and different. But the whole thing that kind of draws me all the way through is the characters and how you feel about them, and hopefully touching you to make you feel grief or fear for them or whatever it is. And I had developed an idea which just wasn't warm-hearted. And so I basically just thought, I'm just going to sit and think of a different idea, which is oddly, I know I'm really different from, I think, 99% of people on this, because that is actually how I do it. I think most people kind of go around and wait for inspiration to come to them, and it'll come at a really unexpected time. For some reason, that's not how I work at all. I go, right, finish that book, time for the next book, and I sit in a chair and I go, I shall think of an idea now. And then I think of an idea. So I'm like, I'm a bit boring, really, but that's how I do it. And I just wanted something that was really human. And I just thinking about, okay, if it was me and I had to think of an event, a thing that happened to me, which was just mind-blowing and had turned my whole life upside down, what would it be? And the thing that for some reason crept into my head was, what if I woke up with a hangover and found that there was a dead person next to me? And that's why I started from this perspective of Louise in Lie Beside Me, a very different perspective to the victim or to the victim's sort of friends. I started from the point of the view of the person who found the body and really, really didn't know whether or not she'd done it. Because that just made me go, yeah, this has made me feel something. And I think it also harked back to sort of some previous experiences I'd had with, I mean, I remember waking up after a night out and being quite afraid of what I'd done. And I do get terrible hangover anxiety now. So it's all, interlinked with that. But I just, that was the idea that really appealed to me. So for my third book, the other perspective is actually Louise, who has found this body, and her fight to work out what happened whilst trying desperately to hide this body in her bed. Because apart from anything else, she should have been, the only person who should have been in her bed was her husband, who was away, and trying to explain to her husband that she was somehow sleeping next to a dead man is a horrendous thing for anyone to have to face. So there's a lot of her getting in the way of the investigation for various reasons. And she has a lot of secrets herself. And essentially she ends up telling them in a series of letters she writes to her husband in an effort to explain herself and everything that's gone on. And I had a lot of fun with that. I found it really quite satisfying to do it that way.
Letter writing was a really neat way of doing it because it allowed you to do it in a way that meant that you could tell the story from her perspective faster. You get a lot more of her story in than you would do if you were doing it in a normal dialogue way.
That's how I felt, and I liked giving her own independent, kind of uninterrupted voice as well, in a way that, of course, in a police interview and in dialogue, that never happens because it's always this two-way thing. Whereas with the letters she writes, it's purely her and purely her giving her view. But also that means that it's innately a little bit unreliable because you don't know whether she's telling her husband the truth. Because obviously, if you did wake up next to a dead stranger, you might potentially fudge things a little bit. And so that's half of the interest, is trying to work out, what she is and isn't hiding, and how much of what she's saying really is spot on.
When doing dialogue for police interviews, I did notice in your earlier two books that you were pretty good at working out what the question was that would unlock an investigation. Why do you think you've been so practiced at that?
So practice at the
question that would unlock an investigation, because I think it must take ages to work out the right question to unlock something in an interview setting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's very interesting when you decide how you want your main investigator to be and what you think is important about them. And I went through quite a bit with Jonah, where I wasn't sure whether he was someone who was going to be really sort of straightforward and dogged and determined, just get there by hard work, or whether he was going to be a real charmer, or whether he was going to be aggressive. And eventually what I decided was that I had personally had quite a lot of experience, for an unfortunate reason of having managed to get myself into an abusive relationship with someone. I had quite a lot of experience of being grilled by someone who would just attack at the right moment in the right way to make you doubt yourself. So it's a form of gaslighting in a funny way. So what Jonah does is a little bit uncomfortable, and it's essentially a way of wrong-footing people to get to what you want. And for Jonah, I thought, well, if I'm writing about this from my own experience and I know how it works because I've had someone do it to me, I thought, well, what about an investigator who actually has had exactly that same experience himself and knows what to say and knows how to break someone down because he has grown up with someone who does this exact thing. And so basically for Jonah, all of this stuff comes from his father, who was he was a coercive controller. He was a narcissist. He would find other reasons to be angry with other people and attack them for it, which is very common in sort of narcissistic personalities. And so for Jonah, rather than that having just sort of broken him down, which for a while it did until his mother drew him away and left Tommy, the father, it's then something that's actually he's turned into a strength. The interesting thing there being that he kind of doesn't like himself when he does it, because obviously if you have been victim to this, and you can see that it's a real skill and you can see that you are good at it, but it reminds you of your horrible dad, it's going to be quite a complicated reaction. So for him, every time he does it, it is slightly uncomfortable. And I find that quite fun to write. I'm cruel to my characters sometimes.
You've got to be able to cruel to be kind, I think, is a good technique. But when it comes to cruel to be kind, though, it must be difficult to decide what to do with the one-off characters that are only going to be in the book once. I mean, how dark do you go when they're only going to be in one book?
Yes, it's a really good question, and I think I probably care for them all as much as I care for my police officers in a strange way. I mean, some to a greater and lesser degree. I mean, some of them have more unpleasant characteristics, and some of them have more lovely characteristics, and some of them are infuriating but fun. And I think unless you end up growing quite attached to them, it's quite difficult to really do them justice. And that means that you have to be able to slightly torture them by giving them these really hard circumstances, but also somehow save them as well. And whether that's because that is actually by giving them a jail sentence because they've killed someone, because that's what's just, or whether it's letting them grow beyond this unhealthy relationship that they're currently in, whatever that is. I think you have to kind of love them, and what they say, kill them as well. Kill your darlings. But I think you have to find a way of embracing each and every one of them, because the only time I think I've not done that was I remember writing a draft of the last book where I just looked at this character and thought it's so two-dimensional, and it's because basically I just made them into a bad guy. And the reality is that even the baddest of bad guys, even my abusive ex-boyfriend, was not bad because he intended to be bad. He wasn't bad because he had massive problems. And finding a way to get a handle on that and somehow give them something that makes you have affection for them is quite important, I think. And there's an interesting one thread that's running through with one of my police officers with someone who's harassing them, and at some point I'm going to have to make sure I find enough reason to still have affection for that harassing character, even while clearly that's not a healthy situation and it's the wrong thing to be doing.
Definitely the case, because if you've got to have empathy for all the characters, I suppose it must be really difficult to have empathy for the villains. So
it's hard, isn't it? It's hard, and I want to do that without ever justifying it, because it's not right that anyone should lose their life because someone's got ambitions or whatever it is. It's not right, and they deserve justice, but there has to be something in them that you understand, that you relate to. Otherwise, they're not real, I think, and they're not satisfying.
Yeah. When it came to Watching from the Dark and the victim that you're writing from, what made you make her into an artist? Because that was a bit of a different one.
I think I'd sort of decided what she was like as a person before I decided on what she did. And in that one, Zoe is very warm and she's very sparky and she puts a lot into other people. And I was instinctively drawn to something that was maybe a bit creative and a bit freelance, a bit flexible for a job, because I think it's much easier to let your life be dominated by other people if your work is something that you fit around all of that, rather than having a 9-to-5 job. So I think I was partly drawn to that. And then I decided to make her a student because I wanted this strange dynamic between her and Aidan, who witnesses the murder, who is, older and a member of staff at the university, and it's a complicated relationship that probably shouldn't have been happening. And I think that was then immediately pushed me in the direction of then thinking, well, then she's an art student, because at Southampton you have the Winchester School of Art, which is a great place, and it's a good place for her to be going to. And I think also, I have a lot of friends who are some very very talented artists who really live in that world, and I do find it very fascinating as well. I love hearing them talk about artworks. It's very different from the way we talk about books, and I find it really really engaging and also quite exotic and strange. So I had quite a lot of fun making her someone who creates something completely different to me.
And their friends were crucial to the plot as well.
Yes.
When you were coming up with their personalities, where did they come from?
So a lot of that was I have actually got a friend who reminds me of Zoe a bit. She's one of these people who she's so warm and lovely and puts herself last all the time. And the net result of that is she has a lot of very, very dependent friends kind of orbiting around her all the time. They lean on her very hard. And she's brilliant at pretending it's all fine and being, cheery and bubbly. But actually, the reality is it does grind her down. And sometimes she's just, she needs to lean on some of the rest of us because she's finding it really tough. And I find that whole dynamic absolutely fascinating. And I think it's quite common. I think there often is a person who is quite self-sacrificing, who's at the centre of a friendship group. And I think that whole relationship can be marvellous, but also can be very unhealthy. And I was really interested in exploring that. So particularly with one of her friends, Angeline, who has an eating disorder, and she is a very key figure in her attempts at sort of recovery and treatment. So she sort of puts a lot onto Zoe with that, and doesn't really function brilliantly without her, but also sort of guilts her into making her feel like she has to be there for her all the time, when the reality is she would maybe be better off if sometimes she had to deal with things for herself. And that was very interesting to me as a dynamic. And then Maeve is she's the friend. I mean, I'm sure we all have this friend. There's a friend who always asks you for advice and tells you they're having a crisis and complains about it and things, and justifiably, because they're normally having a really bad time. But then no matter what you say, obviously they never take that advice. They never do the thing that would help them. They just want you to sit and sort of say, oh, poor you, and let them complain at you. And that's all they really want. And gradually you learn this. You learn that all you need to do is sit and listen. And it's to a certain extent, there's another friend in the group who's not entirely dissimilar from that, but who's had some PTSD and needs a different sort of help. So all these characters they're kind of drawn from a sort of slightly different, but sort of people that I've met or people I've come across, or a type of person that I've seen. And then been modified and drawn in different directions. But I think that's a lot of the fun of writing, is to then mould them into a slightly different shape and then see where they end up.
In the new book, there was less moulding because there was less characters than not usual. Is that down to the fact that you'd written 2 before and decided that you didn't want to put too many characters in?
Interesting thought, actually. I mean, I sort of did wonder about that with the second one, whether to, leave it to fewer. I think it was more that the story that I had developed just instinctively ended up with slightly fewer, or at least slightly few. Rather than it being one group that operated all the time together and they were all very much, a unit. That essentially you had a woman and her partner, and then you had the victim and the people that he knew, and then it turns out maybe some links between them, or maybe her friend might have been involved, and so you kind of do draw in these other people. And I think the cast of characters is sort of slightly different because people kind of get drawn in at slightly different times and in different ways. So rather than being a kind of a group that you have to get to know all at once, they kind of tease into the story. So I suppose it's just ended up being unintentionally a little bit different. And I found it, good fun in that way. And I actually think one of the characters, her friend April, is probably my favourite character I've written so far, actually, in an interesting way. Didn't really expect her to be, but I had a lot of fun with her, and I ended up kind of thinking, oh, maybe I'll find a way of bringing that character back in some other way. But it was good fun.
What made you decide to make her American? Because I did feel a bit sorry for the audio narrator, because you got some of the American, and you got Donal, who's Irish as well.
Actually, the worst thing was, it was really cruel of me, because I think probably when I was just first starting to write it, I had this conversation with John Hopkins, who does the narration for the sort of Jonah Strands, who's fabulous. But he said to me, I was literally ready to kill you over this second book, because you have a scene where you have a Northern Irish girl being interviewed by a Southern Irish police officer with his Birmingham colleague next to him. And he was just like, why did you do this? And then he said, but fortunately, he did his bit after the lovely Burnett Robinson did her bit, and she did not put any accents in. And he was like, yes, I won't put accents in. So he just kind of did it straight. And so actually, he came out fine for that one. And so obviously I felt he'd had far too easy a time with it. And I just have to make it really difficult for him in this one. But I just love that. I love that accent. I love that. So April's from Tennessee. And I met someone, I think it was at an event actually, who had this amazing Tennessee accent. And I just fell in love with it. I just wanted a character in my book to have it. And then I changed her, and so she was a very different person to this lovely young woman I'd met. But I just adored it, and I think the character molded itself around that voice. And suddenly she was this very big, dominant character, and obviously had to have lots of space in the book. So space I made.
Yeah, I mean, without her as supporting without her supporting the thing, you needed another voice that wasn't the narrator's voice, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's interesting when they have how the voicing works for the audiobook. I think with the I think it's a really good call to split it down into two people, but they could do more. You know, they could actually have actual cast. You know, they could do it as a proper sort of dramatized version, and I'd be interested to see that's something that would be of interest. You know, where you have all the different actors doing different voices. But at the moment, we have this sort of tradition of Jonah Strand done by John, and then the other strand done by a woman so far. And I have to say, I was so delighted to get Louise Brealey doing it. I just think she's wonderful. I mean, she's basically, I think if I had to imagine someone who I think most summed up Louise, it probably would be her. And she's even got the same name, which was in no way intentional.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really delighted by that, and I think the way the two play off together. So I've only heard a very little bit, but having sort of had snippet of both, I think it's lovely, just lovely the way they do it. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of the accents come in, because I haven't got to that bit yet. So it's
They are very
delightful.
good. They are very, very good. Yeah, very good.
Can't wait.
I was curious about that. You say about multiple voices, because in She Lies in Wait, as well as you, there was 3 other narrators as well. So there was 4 back then. So
yes, we did have more. Yeah, we did have more because of the different, because of the more perspectives. So we've streamlined it a little bit to being, but most of it was still just the 2 of them. It was Amy Fee and Ed was doing Aurora, and then John doing Jonah.
Jonah's relationship is very complicated, and it gets even more complicated in this book. I do feel a bit sorry for Jonah and the relationships. What made you decide to make it so complicated for him?
I'm glad you feel sorry for him, because I think that's good that you feel for him in this. I think my experience in life is that relationships often do end up quite complicated, and I just felt there was a kind of realism to things not being an directly easy ride, and not. I think there's a big tradition in detective books where the thing that gets in the way of their relationship is their obsession with their work, and that's the one thing that stops every police officer from being happy with their partner, is they're obsessed with their work. And I'm sure it can happen, and it does happen, but I just thought it was more interesting to have him sort of stuffing up his relationships for completely other reasons, and just to think about what happens in what the complications of life in general. So for him, I mean, he has a slightly odd. There's a slight police-specific complication where he clearly likes someone who is a suspect at the time, who he's liked for a very long time, and it's quite inappropriate for him to do anything about it. So he doesn't at the time, but then if that's going to progress, that's obviously riddled with delays, suspense, and giving it enough time, which of course opens up the door for other things to happen in the meantime, which they can and they do. And I think what I wanted to make sure is that Jonah was quite human in this, in that he, the mistakes he makes are mistakes that quite often people do make, such as seeing an ex-partner and feeling very drawn to them again, and not being quite sure how they feel, and regretting past relationship failures, and just generally just being uncertain. And I think then what is quite sort of interesting about it is giving him then decisions that have to be made, which are muddied and confused and not clear. It's not that this is what he should do and that's right and that's wrong, but that either sort of scenario has to be a choice, has to be a weighing up, because that feels like life to me. It feels like life. It feels like being a grown-up, that it's never really, it's never quite straightforward. It's never really the case that, in order to decide between 2 people, it gets easy because one of them goes and kills a dog, like happens in romantic films sometimes. It's like, aha, he is the bad guy. Although oddly, oddly, I say that. Actually, when I was with this terrible partner, that's kind of almost what happened. Is basically he did something so awful that I was just like, what am I doing? But basically, a small child had gone missing on the beach. We just discovered it. His mother had just discovered it nearby us, and I immediately sort of set into action, trying to go, right, we need to help. And he told me not to interfere, got in the car and started trying to drive away in my car, because he said it was more important to get home than to find a 3-year-old who'd gone missing. So to me, that was like, oh, this is the moment in the film when I when I get my act together and go, no, he's the bad guy. So we go. It does happen sometimes.
It's really complicated. I mean, to put her in another country though was a bit evil.
That's very evil, isn't it? Make it really complicated by making them not even there to remind you that that's what you're in, what you want right now. But then I think, I think it's also probably fairly real for someone who has just been through a murder inquiry, has realised that certain deaths in their past were responsibility of someone that they cared about and liked, and all sorts of things like that. That maybe it has an impact and does make you want to kind of flee for a while. So that was the why. That was the why. I wasn't just being mean. I was trying to be real as well.
Yeah, definitely was real. I mean, it's really interesting because you can tell that you planned it out, because the way that characters pop in and pop out, you don't see that often. Is there anyone that you've read that's done that?
Oh, it's interesting.
Or was that just something you decided to do?
Because I think the only, I mean, it's hard to bring to mind. I'm sure there are that I've read and sort of thought, oh, that's really good, because I know that lots of series that I really like because I love the stories of the detectives, and I think it's one of the things that the Robert Galbraith books do very well, is to make you care enormously about Strike and Robin. But I think ones where that sort of slight complexity sort of happens. I mean, I loved the Dorothy Sayers books when I was a teenager, so 13, 14. Absolutely loved them and was obsessed with them. And I remember very strongly that I was younger than that. I must have been sort of 11, 12-ish. But then it was before I got into gritty crime. But I loved the fact that Harriet Vane is this sort of obvious love interest of his. And he really likes her. He meets her and immediately works out that he likes her, works to save her from being hanged for a crime she didn't commit. But then she doesn't immediately go, oh, I'll go out with you, because she's like, no, I don't think I like you like that. And then there's just years of the two of them kind of dancing around each other, and her popping up in one and then away in another one, and him going to some parties with a different attractive woman in another thing, and maybe you think they might get together, then that doesn't happen. And it just seems very real to me. And I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed being kept in suspense over it. And I was always a bit sad when she didn't appear in a book. But then, loved the fact that it was kind of really, it drew me on. It made me want to know. And so I think there's maybe that's the archetype for this in my head. And the books that we read when we're 11 or 12 years old have a massive impact.
Well, it's definitely worked for me. We seem to have quite a few comments down the side. I don't know whether there's the question in the audience that you can spot. That you might
oh, cool. Shall I have a look? That's great. That's much better than trying to eye what my 10-year-old is doing over there. This is much better. Great. Oh, lots of. I'll try and answer all of them. That's great. I'm sure I can do it in a succinct manner and not leave people waiting too much. So that's cool. Stu, yes. The human aspect is so important for me. I think it is the driving force. I mean, it is the heart and soul for me of every book. It's the people. I love them, and I've always loved them in writing theatre as well. I've always loved to care about every character, and even if it's Lucretia Borgia's completely messed up psychopathic brother who kills people, to make him a character that you somehow sort of like as well, or sort of connect with. And I was trying to describe to my publishers recently what I think makes my books. And I was saying, I really love to have a really unusual hook and something really strong. But then I think the thing that carries for me is the people and just wanting heart in it. And that's the nice thing was they agreed. So I wasn't left feeling like I wasn't managing it. So hopefully they weren't just being polite. This is good. Some lovely kind comments about loving She Lies in Wait. That's fabulous. Oh, and we've got someone who's a new author last year. Excellent. You need to let us know what the book is in the comments somewhere, and then we can have a look. Oh, someone did the book at one of the branches last year. That's lovely. Oh, brilliant. I hope they liked it. And asking when the book is out. So Lie Beside Me comes out in a month, or less than a month now. It's on March the 18th. It's already come out in ebook and in audiobook book format. It launches on Thursday, so it's very close. So this is Lie Beside Me, which is the newest one, which is about Louise waking up next to a dead man, and not to, I shouldn't have favourite children, but this is my favourite so far. Maybe book 4 will be my favourite again, who knows? But youngest child's always the spoilt one. That's how it works. But yeah. Libraries and research. So, and there's a question about signed copies. Absolutely. For existing books, I have signed copies on my website, which is actually my blog site, which I just haven't yet turned into a proper author site because I'm just useless like that. So it's imperfectsingleparent.blog, but I can I can post the link in comments when we're done. But basically, if you want to get any signed books of the existing ones, then that's where to go. If you'd like a signed book of Lie Beside Me when it's out in March, I have a cunning way of doing this using my launch event on the night, where if you basically go onto the launch event and then order a book, I can then sign it on the night. And even if you don't make it to the event, I can still sign it and send it. So it's all cool. And Bookish, who are fabulous, are providing all the books. So it works brilliantly. And I'm very pleased with that plan. I'll have details of that out very soon. I was going to look at... Yes, libraries. Sorry, I skipped on. So libraries and research is an interesting one. I have done in the past, certainly. I more recently mostly ended up using sort of talking to people for research, having kind of managed to sort of get a network of people who know about various topics. I found it incredibly useful to kind of run things by them, partly because sometimes I'm not even sure what question I'm trying to ask, and it gets quite difficult, particularly with the police stuff. Embarrassingly, I originally had access to the police for the first book because my abusive ex-partner, who I've mentioned now several times for some reason, had probation officers who used to come round, and I just was like, while you're here, do you fancy answering some questions about stuff? And they were lovely to me. They were great. They told me all I needed to know and then recommended where to ask more questions. But now I've realised that I have a good friend in the Met Police, and he has been for the last 2 books, he has been my source of information. He's been fabulous. And I can't recommend him enough for anyone who's trying to write. So you write me a message if you need a police informant, because he's fabulous.
I was going to ask you about the police stuff, because you do use that as your structure for your book, because you often say about how long's left on the arrest time.
I do. I like having a bit of a clock on things, and I like it to be accurate as well, because I know a lot of writers don't really mind too much if it's accurate. It's just I remember so vividly a while back reading this absolute tirade from a police officer who was just saying, here's a list of the ridiculous things that happen in books. And I read through it and was like, oh, I didn't even know that was wrong. Oh my goodness. And I just thought, it would have been so easy just to write all this stuff completely incorrectly, because there are very specific rules on how long you're allowed to hold someone before you charge them, and you can apply to get it extended. So in case anyone wants to know about this, you can apply to the superintendent to have an extension, but that has to be for a good reason, and it might not be granted. And even if it is granted, your still maximum is 96 hours. So you can't hold someone for any longer than that without being charged. And that is, I think, quite a good thing to know, because it does show you the kind of pressure that the police are under to kind of get all their ducks in a row very quickly. And it might also show why there is sometimes a delay to arresting someone, because once you arrest them, the clock is actually ticking, and you have to find out the truth quite quickly. So for the purposes of fiction, it's very useful. For the purposes of fact, it's very accurate, and I quite like it.
Yeah, I like the way that you've done that to structure the book, and you also have. Because you've got a number of different characters, you have them finding out different things, and then they come in and tell Jonah that they found it, which is, you don't get that often in books either.
I love team dynamics, and I love this idea. And I think, sadly, this is probably because I used to work for a while for like an HR training company, that it's the Belbin people who do a test. It's like the Myers-Briggs test, but it kind of works out how you work in a team. And the whole ethos behind the whole place is that everyone has their correct role in a team and they fulfill it. And if a team is doing a function well, you need that balance. You know, you can't have 5 people who are the same and be an effective team. You need to cover all of these bases. And without really meaning to, I basically kind of wrote a Belbin team with my detectives. But I love all that. I love how they interact and how everyone has their roles that they're drawn to. So they're all police officers, but they are all, you know, they are completely different individuals, and they all came to the force for very different reasons. They get different things out of it. And I think, you know, because in reality, obviously, the DCI wouldn't do masses of investigating himself. He is managing it. It's really good fun to have that actually happen and to see how that works. And I've made him a bit more proactive than most DCIs are. In all honesty, I have had to explain away a few times when he clearly should have been in a meeting by now. But, you know, I have explained it. It's okay. He has a very nice DCS who lets him work like that. So we get around that way.
Yeah, I must admit, I do like the way you did it in this one. I'm not going to say why, because obviously it's just really interesting. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad. Excellent.
And wonder if there's any more audience questions out there, or have you just gone through them all?
Brilliant. Oh, look, and Samantha's managed to post the blog link. So clever. Any characters I'd like to put in a future book with a backstory of their own? Yeah, I think there's so far. I mean, it's mostly April in book 3, but I don't know yet. I've yet to decide how that would work. It's complicated for various reasons. You'll find out, and but it would be fun. I would have a lot of fun with that. You know, just because of her accent in my head. But other ones I don't know. I mean, there is a character from the first one who does run through, who, as I've mentioned, with Jonah's relationship with them. Yeah, we'll have to see with others. It might be something that becomes immensely satisfying once I get to book 12, is to have a little kind of trip down memory lane and bring someone back. But we'll have to see how it happens. And what else? I don't want to miss any questions. Oh, what do you think makes crime so enduringly popular with readers? So, for me, I will tell you why I like crime, and I don't know if that's universal, but I think there's something absolutely fascinating about seeing people in the very most extreme of situations. And I think there are various reasons for that. One is that it shows you a lot about people. One, I think, is that there's something quite comforting about imagining worse things happening, you know, to others, and almost thrilling and frightening to remind yourself that stuff could happen to you and is out there. So I think those are some reasons. I also think that people love a puzzle, and I think for me, as long as it's a puzzle with some feeling and heart, as I've said, I think I do too, because I mean, I'm a massive crossword fan. It's quite sad, actually, how much I like them. And I'm always that person. I mean, I'm that really annoying one when you're all trying to watch a series like The Bridge or something, who's like, oh, I bet it's that guy, and is trying to work it out ahead of time. But I don't know if anyone else is the same as I am. I went through a while where I was like, I'd be a great police officer because I'm always working this stuff out. Then I eventually realised that it would be a lot more challenging if there wasn't a narrator bringing the person in at just the appropriate point in the book and making them do something suspicious, or you know, some spooky music, or a significant look that the detective wouldn't actually have seen. So this is where I eventually realised that actually I'd be a terrible policeman, but might be okay at books. So hence my career choice.
That's a good reason to write there, isn't it?
I think it is. You know, frustrated police officer. Couldn't you know, pass half the tests, but you know, can write a book. So.
When it comes to the later books in the series, I know that we've been saying that you've planned out layers, but there must be something that you think, oh, there must be a kind of method of murder that you might want to use later. Is there anything that you spotted in other people's books and you go, oh, why did you do that first before I could do it?
Oh, interesting. No, oddly, no, not so far. I think partly because, I mean, to be fair, it's always possible, particularly if you have an idea and then it takes you a year to write the book, and then it takes another year to be published, or maybe a bit less than that, but it's quite a long time. And I think I do live in dread of writing a book and then someone else bringing one out with the same idea just before. But I think the reason that I haven't found that so far is partly that my kind of aim is always to find something which is a bit different to the other things. And if it does turn out that someone I haven't read has done something a little bit similar, I then go, okay, don't worry about it. It's okay, and I don't resent it, because I think maybe it tells me that actually that sort of basic idea is one people find satisfying, and it's particularly good if it's a book that's worked really well. You think, okay, I was onto a good decision. I do still find it quite funny, and a little bit infuriating, but mostly funny, that one of I think it's currently the highest up review on my Amazon page for She Lies in Wait is someone saying that I'd kind of ripped off a book that I hadn't read. And I was like, okay, they don't know that, it's fine. But then they went on telling me why the other book was better and I should have done it more like that book, which I was like, I'm not sure. I don't know where to go with this. Did you want me to write that book or not write that book? And eventually I decided that actually I should have just been that writer, and then that would have been fine. So, it's fine. But I think that's the thing. And I think the thing that I learned at that point with reviews is that they are often useful. Everyone who's reviewing has, some feedback, which is useful to say, but you've got to work out whether you're going to take it on board and take it to heart, or just say, okay, I totally understand why they thought that, but that's because they like a slightly different sort of book to me. Or maybe just they're a super fan of this other author and I'm never going to be able to touch that. That's okay. That's okay. So it was an interesting learning point. It still does make me laugh, though. It still makes me chuckle.
Yeah, because I do find it very difficult to write constructive reviews and make sure that I'm not kind of like giving too much of a dig at things. It is hard.
I think it's really hard. And I think often, I sympathise now much more as well when, often I get sent books to sort of ask if I'd like to, endorse them as a writer, and so I'll get sent them really early on, and I wonder about that too, because often I feel like I want to say I love this element of this book, but I thought this element maybe could do a bit of work, because I think that would be useful feedback, and we were definitely taught to do that when I was on the UEA MA. You say it in a nice positive way, but you say the constructive feedback, but knowing how much is useful and how much isn't is really hard. And I think I came to the conclusion at that point that I could only be helping them with a future book, because this book's too late. Like, it's done. Done. So all I could be saying was maybe just a piece of feedback. Maybe it was actually quite hard to keep track of these characters because of this. You chopped and changed viewpoint quite a lot, so I just found it a bit hard. But I loved the book. Is probably the only way to go. But I know I really, now I'm trying to do it. I really sympathise, and I want to be supportive.
Yeah, I do find it really difficult. But when you've replied to my reviews, you've been really nice about it, and I just wondered what you'd learned from reviews that you might have used in your own book. Later.
Gosh, lots. I think because every review tells you what the focus is. And, in your case, you talked a lot about particular characters and about how satisfying you found those. And that is immediately useful feedback, because it shows me what people are really taking from the book and whether it's worth doing more of this thing or less of this thing. Or if someone said to me, I just didn't like this whole half of the book, the Louise strand, for example, didn't work for me, then I'd think, maybe I need to think about why that is. What is it they're not gelling with? And, why is it? Is it her character? Is it whatever? Whereas if people are saying, I loved this, I loved reading about this, then it tells you that, you could expand more on that in the future. And then of course, you then get lots of different reviews. So you have to kind of weigh them all up and then work out if, whether these reviews are coming from people who like your stuff in general and are kind of your core readers, or they're sort of outliers who have a slightly different view, and maybe, you shouldn't pursue every single comment, because apart from anything else, you will have one person saying, I hated Louise, and the next person saying, I loved Louise. So you have to choose. And I think it's a really interesting one. But yes, I mean, I think reviews are absolutely key. I think they're fabulous things. And I think you learn pretty early on to how to read them in a way that is positive. You don't take it personally, and you just go, okay, what are they trying to tell me? And it's good.
On that note, all I would say to people that haven't ordered the ebook yet or aren't yet members of Audible, definitely join Audible if you want to hear American voices and all sorts of weird complications for the narrator. Go for it, because I really enjoyed it, and I've been a fan of Gytha's for 3 years now, ever since I met her at Pigstons, and I'll always want to read anything else she writes. Thank you so much for
You're
great
the
hour.
best. And I'm a huge fan of yours too. So there we go. Mutual. We'll have to put up statues to each other.
Yeah. Thank you so much for a great hour, and hopefully when the next book comes out, I'll be able to review that as well, because I love them.
Oh, would love it. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for everyone who's come along to listen. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.